Brian Randall Schaefer was born on February 11, 1979, in Ohio. He was the oldest of two brothers, close to his family, and known for balancing two distinct worlds, the demanding road of medical school and the creative escape of music. To everyone who knew him, Brian was gentle, thoughtful, and quietly bright. He picked up a guitar the way some people pick up a language fluently, naturally. He talked often about wanting to start a band someday. Medicine was a future. Music was a heartbeat. Friends describe him as a mix of discipline and daydreams, studying late into the night, then unwinding with Pearl Jam songs and notebook scribbles filled with lyrics. But the spring of 2006 was marked by something far heavier than exams or dreams. On March 6th, Brian's mother, Renee, the person he was closest to, passed away after battling a rare cancer. Her loss hit the family deeply. Brian, especially, seemed changed. He did not fall apart on the outside. He kept going. He studied. He made plans. But those closest to him could see grief's shadow in the pauses between his words. In the weeks that followed, Brian and his girlfriend, Alexis, tried to create something good to look forward to: a spring break trip to Miami, a brief escape. Time to breathe. Brian mentioned to his mother, shortly before she died, that he might propose during that trip. Whether he would have or not, no one can say for certain. But the idea painted a picture of a young man imagining a future beyond grief. By the last day of March, exams were over, spring break was beginning, and Brian seemed ready for one night of release. He had dinner with his father, Randy, at a nearby restaurant. Randy later said the meal felt emotional, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything ordinary suddenly felt fragile after losing Renee. As they parted ways that night, Brian promised to come by the next morning to help around the house. It was the last promise he ever made to his father. Later that same evening, Brian contacted his friend, William Clint Florence. The two decided to go out for drinks. Clint drove to Brian's apartment, where they left their cars and began the familiar ritual of bar hopping through the Columbus campus area. At around 10 that night, Brian called Alexis. She remembered the call clearly. They talked about the Miami trip. He told her he loved her. Before hanging up, it was an ordinary conversation. But it would become the final one. The night unfolded with laughter, rounds of drinks, and a slow migration from one bar to another. Sometime after 1 a.m, the group reached the ugly Tuna Saloona, a dim, second-floor bar in the South Campus gateway. The Tuna was small, one room, a balcony overlooking the courtyard, and a construction zone toward the back of the building that night. A place crowded with students unwinding after midterms. Cameras captured Brian, Clint, and a friend named Meredith riding the escalator up to the bar at around 1:15 in the morning. Brian looked relaxed. Tired, maybe, but present, engaged. The final 39 minutes of his known life had now begun. Inside the bar, the noise was typical of a Friday night, a mix of music, shouts, clinking glasses, and the static energy of dozens of exhausted students celebrating freedom from midterms. But just before 2 a.m, Brian stepped outside the bar onto the landing area. Cameras there captured him speaking to two women. He was polite, calm, friendly. Some accounts say he exchanged numbers with one of them. It was a simple moment, but a critical one. Because after speaking to the women, Brian turned and moved back toward the bar entrance. And from that moment on, no camera ever captured him again. Not inside the bar, not leaving it, not on the escalator, not at the emergency exit, not anywhere on the dozens of surrounding cameras in one of the most surveilled blocks in the city. He simply vanished in a place where vanishing was almost impossible. By the time Brian stepped out of frame, the moment the surveillance camera caught him turning back toward the entrance, the night was nearing closing time. Inside the ugly Tuna, last call energy swelled. Bartenders wiping down counters, patrons finishing drinks, conversations rising over the fading music. But outside, on that narrow landing, Brian's friends noticed something. He didn't come back, at least, not where they could see. According to Clint and Meredith, the two friends he'd been with that night, Brian told them he was going to speak with the band. He seemed casual, unhurried. There was no argument, no dramatic exit, nothing alarming. But a few minutes later, when the bar lights brightened and the crowd thinned, Brian was nowhere in sight. They called his phone. They texted him. They checked the restroom. They scanned the bar. Nothing. To Clint and Meredith, at that moment, there was no reason to panic. It was late. People drift in and out of bars without warning. They assumed Brian had stepped outside, maybe to get air, maybe to leave early. Maybe he'd gotten tired. Maybe he caught a ride with someone. Maybe he was simply done for the night. But then came the detail that has troubled investigators and viewers for years. Clint claimed that he left the bar, waited for Brian, continued calling him, and eventually, unable to find him, walked to Brian's apartment and waited there for hours. He said he sat there, expecting Brian to come home any minute. He didn't. The next morning, April 1st, was meant to be ordinary. Brian had promised to come to his father's house and help clean up. Randy waited and waited and waited. No call, no text, no knock on the door. At first, he assumed Brian had overslept after a long night out. It happened. His son was 27. Life was heavy. A break from responsibility for one morning wasn't alarming on its own. But Alexis, Brian's girlfriend, felt differently. When her calls went unanswered that day, she drove back to Columbus. At Brian's apartment, she found something unsettling. His car parked exactly where he left it. His bedroom undisturbed. His suitcase for Miami untouched. His bed perfectly made bid. His keys and personal items still inside. But no Brian. The silence inside that apartment was louder than any alarm. By evening, fear hardened into certainty. Something was wrong. Alexis and Randy went to the police to report Brian missing. They explained the situation carefully. His mother had passed only weeks earlier, he was preparing for an important trip, and he would not simply disappear without telling someone. But the officers on duty, following departmental protocol, declined to file a missing person report. They suggested waiting until the next morning to see whether Brian boarded his scheduled flight to Miami. To a grieving father, it made no sense. To Alexis, it was unthinkable. To investigators reviewing the case years later, it was a devastating delay. But rules were rules. And so, the clock began ticking. April 2nd came. And, as Randy predicted, Brian did not appear at the airport. Only then did police open an official missing person investigation. For everyone involved, this marked the beginning of a long, punishing truth. The most critical hours in Brian's case, the ones where evidence is freshest, where cameras hold unerased recordings, where potential witnesses still remember small details, had already passed. A full day gone. A full day that would never come back. The search that followed was immediate and intense, but it was no longer early. And in the world of missing persons, not early often means too late. One of the first steps investigators took was reviewing surveillance from the Ugly Tuna and nearby businesses. They expected something, anything, to show where Brian went. Instead, what they saw deepened the mystery. Brian was seen entering the bar. He was seen outside the bar. He was seen walking toward the entrance again. But he was never seen leaving. Not down the escalator. Not via the main door. Not using the emergency exit. Not in the construction hallway. Not on the balcony stairs. Not in any surrounding cameras. In a building with limited entrances. In a block full of surveillance. In a city with thousands of cameras. A 27-year-old man walked into view and then vanished. Investigators now faced a baffling reality. Either Brian left the bar undetected, slipping through a blind spot no camera caught, or he never left the building at all. Both possibilities seemed impossible. Yet one of them had to be true. In the continuation, we follow the first days of the official search, the interviews, the cadaver dog sweeps, the construction site inspection, and the chilling realization that the area where Brian was last seen contained dozens of ways to hide a secret, even in a crowded building. When police finally opened the missing person investigation, the first 48 hours had already passed. In a disappearance case, those hours are precious, the window where evidence breathes, where memories stay sharp, where cameras still hold their recordings. Now, investigators were racing time. They began where Brian was last confirmed. The second floor of the South Campus Gateway, outside the Ugly Tuna Saloon. What they found there surprised them not because of what was present, but because of all the things that weren't. Officers first cleared the interior of the bar. They checked the stage area, the restrooms, the back hallways, the narrow corners near the service door. They asked employees whether they remembered Brian. Some did, others weren't sure. But no one recalled seeing him leave. Police expanded the search to the building itself. The Gateway complex had several businesses, shared hallways, a partly unfinished construction zone, and a service area filled with equipment and temporary structures. If Brian walked somewhere disoriented or alone, someone should have seen him. Someone should have heard something. But the building produced no witnesses, no trace, nothing. The unfinished construction area behind the bar had become a popular topic in rumors and online discussions. Some believed Brian may have wandered into it, intoxicated, and become lost or injured. Police examined that area carefully. It was dark, cluttered, and full of hazards. Rebar, exposed piping, drop-offs, and loose construction material. Investigators knew an accident in that environment was possible. Cadaver dogs were deployed. Handlers walked dogs through every corner, every crevice, every section of open flooring and scaffold. The result? No scent trail, no hit, no sign of Brian. Not even the faintest indication that he had passed through. One of the darker possibilities investigators considered was the building's trash chute. If a person fell or was placed inside a chute late on a busy night, the body could be taken to a dumpster below, later collected and transported to a landfill. It is an unsettling thought, but in a case where no exit is seen, all possibilities must be explored. Police reviewed the dumpsters. They checked trash pickup routes. They examined landfill records. Once again, no evidence was found. This theory remained possible, but nothing supported it. The search expanded outward, block by block, street by street. Officers opened manholes to check storm drains and sewer lines. They searched through dumpsters across the Gateway area. They swept nearby alleys and loading docks. They examined any place a person or a body could be hidden. Still nothing. Then came the larger search, the Olentangy River. The river flowed only about half a mile from where Brian lived. If he had walked home alone at night, disoriented or exhausted, he might have tried to cross the surrounding paths. Police considered whether he fell in. Search teams combed the riverbanks. Boats scanned the water. Divers covered sections where debris gathered. The conclusion was the same. No trace of Brian. No clothing. No wallet. No body. No sign that he ever reached the river at all. The Ugly Tuna wasn't the only building with cameras. The entire Gateway area was surrounded by businesses, bars, restaurants, parking garages, retail stores, many of which had their own surveillance systems. Police visited each one. They collected hours of footage, days of footage. They searched frame by frame for a tall, lean young man in jeans and a striped shirt. The results were baffling. People were seen entering and exiting. Cars arrived and left. Crowds moved through the streets. But Brian Schaefer was not visible on any of the surrounding footage. It was as if the moment he walked out of that camera's view, he stopped existing within the visible world of Columbus. One of the detectives later made a rare, firm statement, something investigators seldom do unless they are absolutely certain. He said, "I can say with 100% certainty that Brian did not leave down the escalator." Why would a detective say this? Because every person who walked down that escalator that night was accounted for. Every single one. Except Brian. This meant one thing. If he left the bar, he didn't leave through any direction captured on the main surveillance camera. Which raised the most puzzling question of all. How does a man walk into one of the most surveilled buildings in the city and simply not walk out? As days turned into weeks and police exhausted the obvious avenues, only two realistic explanations remained. Either Brian left the building through a blind spot no camera captured, or he never left the building at all. One was improbable. The other was disturbing. But both would form the backbone of every future theory, every amateur investigation, every podcast, every online discussion. The disappearance had stopped being a simple missing person case. It had become a question of physics, visibility, timing, and human behavior, a puzzle where the pieces seemed to exist, but someone had removed the center before anyone noticed. In the next continuation, we will explore the people closest to Brian, his friends that night, the stories they told investigators, the inconsistencies, the questions that still unsettle many 20 years later, and the emotional legacy his disappearance left on those who loved him most. As investigators combed through every corner of the Gateway complex and every hour of nearby surveillance footage, their attention began to shift, not because the evidence pointed to someone, but because lack of evidence required them to look more closely at the people who knew Brian the best that night. Disappearances rarely happen in a vacuum. Sometimes the truth lies not in what people saw, but in what they didn't say. And the night Brian vanished, only 2 people were with him in those final known moments. Clint, Meredith. Both young, both intoxicated, both the last known individuals to speak to Brian, and both with stories that match just enough. According to their statements, Brian wanted to talk to the band. He walked away from them, inside the bar. They tried calling and texting him when they couldn't find him. They searched the bar. They waited outside. And eventually, believing he had walked home, they left. On its surface, the story made sense, casual, unremarkable, the sort of miscommunication that happens during a loud, alcohol-soaked night out. But the deeper investigators looked, the more cracks began to appear. Some small, some subtle, some impossible to ignore. Friends stick together in loud bars, especially when they've been drinking, especially near closing time, especially on a Friday night in a crowded campus district. Yet Brian, Clint, and Meredith seemed to separate easily, strangely easily, in the final minutes before Brian vanished. According to their account, they entered together, they drank together, they talked together, they stood together at points that night, yet somehow they split without noticing where each other went. And this occurred in a one-room bar, not a nightclub, not a labyrinth. One room. This detail bothered investigators then. It bothers people today. In the days after Brian disappeared, whispers began circulating around campus and online forums. Some claimed that Clint and Brian had argued earlier that week. They may have exchanged sharp words inside the bar. There was tension between the men, quote. Something had happened shortly before Brian walked off alone. None of these details were ever confirmed publicly, but they were never dismissed either. And they aligned with one observation. If Brian had a reason to avoid Clint and Meredith, he might have chosen to leave the bar through a different exit, one not captured clearly by the primary camera. Investigators never ruled this out. This is perhaps the most persistent point of confusion. Clint later told police he went to Brian's apartment and waited there for 6 hours. Not 1 hour, not 2, 6. The questions are unavoidable. Why wait so long instead of going home? Why not call Brian's father earlier? Why not alert Alexis sooner? Why not contact police sooner? The timing felt strange to investigators. It felt even stranger to Brian's family. And then came the detail that shifted the tone of the entire investigation. Police asked both Clint and Meredith to take a polygraph test. Meredith agreed immediately. She took the test. She passed. Clint refused. Not once, not twice, but permanently. Friends and family members would later say that Clint's refusal troubled them deeply, especially because he was the last known friend with Brian that night. Now, refusing a polygraph doesn't prove guilt. Polygraphs are not perfect. Many innocent people decline them on principle or legal advice. But in the emotional reality of a missing person case, refusal casts a long shadow. And that shadow grew. Within weeks, Clint hired a lawyer. Then he stopped speaking to detectives. Then to the media. Then to Brian's family. He closed himself off completely. Eventually, he left Ohio altogether. When a grand jury later subpoenaed him to testify, he declined to appear legally, but firmly. In the eyes of Brian's loved ones, this deepened their suspicion. In the eyes of investigators, it complicated everything. But in the eyes of the law, silence is not guilt. Still, the absence of information from the last known person with Brian became its own kind of presence, a quiet void, a gap in the story where the truth might have lived. While rumors swirled and theories emerged, the Schaefer family was living a nightmare. Derek, Brian's younger brother, said the silence from Clint felt like betrayal. Alexis, the woman Brian planned a vacation and possibly a proposal with, believed Clint knew more than he shared. Randy, their father, desperate for any truth, wrote letters begging Clint to come forward. None were answered. And in September 2008, 2 years after Brian vanished, tragedy struck again. Randy Schaefer died in an accident while cleaning storm debris outside his home. He passed never knowing what happened to his son. The weight of that sadness still reverberates through every discussion of this case. To this day, police have never named Clint a suspect. They have never charged him. They have never released evidence implicating him. But every investigator and every viewer understands the same truth. When the only witnesses don't speak, the silence becomes part of the crime scene. And when a man disappears in a public place, under cameras, under lights, under the eyes of dozens, without a trace, answers often lie not in what is visible, but in the shadows between people. In the next continuation, we follow investigators as they evaluate the deeper theories. Whether Brian walked away, whether an accident occurred, whether he met with foul play, or whether something far stranger happened inside that building. As detectives sifted through dead ends, silence, and hours of empty footage, the case began shifting from a straightforward missing person investigation into something far more complex. The pieces weren't adding up. A man doesn't simply walk into a bar crowded with witnesses, under multiple security cameras, and vanish without leaving a trace. Not in a city, not on a campus, not in a building with controlled exits and monitored hallways. Something had happened. Something that made the ordinary impossible. And so, investigators began laying out the theories, not the wild speculation that spiraled online, but the grounded possibilities shaped by evidence, timing, behavior, and human nature. There were 4 primary pathways investigators needed to explore. Brian left voluntarily. Brian suffered an accident. Brian encountered foul play outside. Something happened inside the bar. Each theory, at first, seemed unlikely. Each theory, upon deeper study, carried weight. But only one could be true. This theory surfaced early, the idea that Brian, overwhelmed with grief from his mother's death and the stress of med school, might have chosen to disappear on his own terms. At first glance, it was a neat explanation, a clean narrative. But the more investigators examined it, the less sense it made. Brian left. His car, his keys, his belongings, his bank account untouched, his phone inactive, his suitcases unpacked for the Miami trip out, and the people he loved without closure. No withdrawals, no digital activity, no verified sightings anywhere in the country. For nearly 2 decades, people don't start a new life by plunging into anonymity with no resources, no money, and no preparation, especially not a man who had promised to see his father the next morning and had a romantic vacation planned days later. Voluntary disappearance remained a theory, but a theory without oxygen. This was among the most plausible theories. If Brian exited through a blind spot, a side door, a service exit, a construction gap, he could have walked out without detection. From there, he would have passed through an area known at the time for violent robberies and assaults and intoxicated confrontations, poorly lit alleyways, unfinished areas under development. If he was unsteady, grieving, or simply distracted, he could have fallen, been injured, or encountered someone dangerous. Police canvassed a 10-block radius. They searched trash bins. They examined rooftops, alleyways, stairwells. They found nothing. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when 24 hours passed before the true search began. If Brian walked into harm's way and was taken quickly, quietly, efficiently, it is possible that evidence disappeared long before anyone knew to look. This theory remained possible, painfully possible. This is the theory that haunted many people. A bar, loud music, alcohol, construction areas, blind corners, a trash chute large enough for disposal, a building that had security vulnerabilities because of ongoing renovation. Could something have happened inside? Could an altercation, accident, or or confrontation have escalated? Some pointed to the construction zone, dark, cluttered, partially sealed off. Others speculated that if Brian was injured and a panic followed, someone might have moved him to avoid responsibility. But here was the problem. If multiple people were involved, someone would have talked. Someone always talks. Guilt leaks. Secrets spread. Bars are not fortresses, they are porous, full of witnesses who don't stay silent forever. Investigators questioned every staff member, musician, and employee present. Nothing pointed to foul play inside. Still, the layout made it possible, even if unlikely. This is the theory that chills even seasoned investigators. If a person enters a building and is never seen walking out through any recorded exit, there are only two remaining options. He left unseen, through a gap in surveillance, or he didn't leave at all. This theory gave rise to the trash chute hypothesis, the accidental fall, the sealed construction area speculation. But the cadaver dogs found no scent. The construction team found no remains. Structural assessments years later found nothing. Still, this theory lingers because the evidence leaves room for it. When cameras fail, blind spots become possibilities. And blind spots can hold secrets. What makes Brian's case so haunting is not simply that he vanished. It's how he vanished, in a crowded bar, surrounded by friends, under surveillance, surrounded by other businesses, with cameras potting, with no evidence of exit day, leaving behind every belonging, with no history of self-harm, no preparatory behavior, no financial activity afterward. Cases like this do not happen, yet this one did. And when something impossible occurs, investigators must look at everything, not just the obvious, but the human patterns, the small choices, the interpersonal dynamics. And so the investigation turned back toward the night itself, the atmosphere inside the tuna, the behavior of those closest to Brian, and the moments before he walked out of view. In the continuation, we step into the heart of the mystery. What was happening inside the ugly tuna that night? What conversations took place? Who saw Brian last? And what did they really see? To understand how a man could enter a crowded bar and never be seen again, investigators had to reconstruct the environment inside the ugly Tuna Saloon during the final hour before Brian disappeared. Not the layout, not the camera angles, not the theories, but the human atmosphere. Because disappearances don't happen in emptiness. They happen in noise, light, emotion, and movement. And the tuna, on that night, was full of all four. It was spring break weekend at a major university. The bars were packed. Students were celebrating the end of midterms. The night was loud, pressurized, chaotic in familiar ways. Inside the tuna, music pulsed heavy from the speakers astart. Drinks sloshed and spilled over tables. People squeezed past each other near the bar counter. Groups formed and dissolved in seconds. Strangers leaned in to shout over music. The balcony doors swung open and shut. Staff ran between the bar and service stations. This wasn't a quiet room where one person's movement could be easily tracked. It was a storm. And within that storm, Brian moved freely visible, social, blending in as any young man out on a Friday night would. But witnesses inside the bar would later say something else. They remembered seeing Brian, but no one remembered seeing where he went. When police canvassed the room, they spoke with bartenders and servers, patrons, band members, security staff, nearby employees in the building. Dozens were interviewed, and while many remembered Brian being present throughout the night, not a single confirmed witness remembered seeing a confrontation involving him bed, an argument, a sudden exit like Bud. He sudden exit repented, a popu, a collapse, a fight, or any moment that might indicate distressors. The most consistent testimony was that the night felt normal right up until the moment it wasn't. The absence of memory is sometimes more haunting than the presence of danger. To the outside world, Brian appeared relaxed, social, engaged. But beneath that surface, witnesses reported something subtle, a tension among the group, a tension that no one could clearly articulate. Some described Clint and Brian as off with each other. Others said the energy felt strained. A few said they thought they heard bits of an argument earlier in the night, nothing heated, nothing dramatic, just quiet discord. But details blur quickly in a bar environment. Memory reshapes, fills gaps, forgets order. Yet one thing remained consistent. Brian didn't seem distressed or angry. He seemed distracted, thoughtful. Some said he looked tired. Others said the grief over his mother still hung on him. This mattered because distraction can lead to vulnerability. Vulnerability can lead to isolation. And isolation can lead to opportunity. For someone. Or for something. According to Clint and Meredith, Brian announced he was going to speak with the band. This was near closing time, a chaotic moment in any bar. People lined up for last drinks. Bartenders rushed to finish tabs. Groups stumbled toward the exit. Lights began to brighten. Sound techs started shutting down equipment to mist. In that chaos, a single person weaving through the crowd could go unnoticed. But there are questions. Which direction did he go? Who was he really walking toward? Did anyone see him pass the bar counter? Did he reach the stage area? Did he walk toward the construction corridor instead? No witness ever confirmed seeing him at the stage. No staff member recalled speaking with him. The band did not remember interacting with him. So the claim that he went to see the band remains unverified. It is not disproven, but it is not supported. And in a case where every detail matters, a missing link becomes a critical link. Behind the bar, there was a partially closed-off construction zone. It was dark, half-built, filled with exposed beams, temporary walls. This bizen. Shaft to vary. Stayed. Equipment. Drop-offs. Scattered debris. Their fellow. Security considered it a restricted area. But restricted does not mean inaccessible. There was a narrow service hallway that ran along the side. A route used by employees to move supplies and trash. People familiar with the building said that sometimes, especially late at night, patrons would slip through if a door was ajar or a barrier wasn't secured. If Brian wandered into that area, drunk, tired, emotional, everyone, or distracted, he could have entered a dangerous space without realizing it. But cadaver dogs later found no scent, no signs of injury, no drop of blood, no evidence of a fall. Still, the possibility remained because the area was large, cluttered, and constantly in flux. It was a place where something could happen, without anyone hearing it, over the bar's closing soundtrack. The Ugly Tuna, despite being on a well-lit second floor with a major escalator entrance, had multiple blind spots. No interior surveillance. Hallways partially hidden. It BRDS. Construction barriers. A service corridor. An emergency exit just beyond camera view minutes. A balcony with a drop to the courtyard part. In an investigation, blind spots are not just empty footage. They are places where truth can hide. And in this case, they were everywhere. At some point, within a span of less than 10 minutes, Brian walked away. His friends lost track of him. He was not seen by staffdom. He was not seen by patron Zio. He was not captured by any camera. He did not answer calls. And he seemingly exited reality. If he left the building, the cameras didn't catch him. If he stayed in the building, no trace of him was ever found. And so investigators were forced into the strange intersection where evidence and impossibility meet. A place where they had to ask not just what happened, but how anything could have happened at all. In the next continuation, we follow the investigation outward into the streets of Columbus, through the dangerous blocks surrounding the bar, into the river search, and through the theories of what might have happened after Brian left the Ugly Tuna, if he did. Once investigators exhausted every angle inside the Ugly Tuna Saloon, they turned their attention outward into the streets surrounding the South Campus Gateway. If Brian had left the bar unnoticed, this was where he would have walked. But this stretch of Columbus in 2006 was not the polished, high-traffic hub it would later become. At that time, the areas just beyond the gateway's bright lights held a very different reputation. Poorly lit walkways, vacant lots, construction patches, Alleyways known for robberies, transient activity, drug deals, violent altercations. If Brian walked out of that building alone, dazed, tired, emotional, or intoxicated, he wasn't walking into safety. He was walking into uncertainty. Brian's apartment was less than a 10-minute walk from the Ugly Tuna. The route was simple. Down the escalator, through the courtyard, out to North High Street, then west toward his building. But that is the route he should have taken. The route cameras should have captured. Instead, no camera caught him on the escalator. No camera saw him crossing the courtyard. No business footage showed him. Along High Street, no resident footage captured him passing nearby buildings. Not a shadow, not a silhouette, not a reflection in glass. If he walked home, he walked invisibly. And in a district saturated with surveillance, invisibility is almost impossible. Investigators worked hard to avoid tunnel vision. They knew that intoxication changes behavior. If Brian had been drunk, exhausted, that is next tane, emotionally overwhelmed. Navigating unfamiliar hallways, navigating familiar hallways. Disoriented by music and darkness, he could have exited through a blind spot or service area. From there, he could have taken the wrong direction, even walked the opposite way from home. This opened several dangerous possibilities. He could have wandered toward an alley. He could have stumbled onto a side street known for crime. He could have crossed paths with someone who saw an opportunity in a vulnerable stranger. Police never dismissed this theory, but they also knew it required believing he passed numerous cameras without being seen. Not likely, but not impossible. In many urban disappearances involving young men, a sudden attack is a realistic threat. A robbery gone wrong. A confrontation turned violent. A predatory attack by someone with a history of opportunistic crime. A kidnapping attempt. Rare, but not unheard of. Columbus police recorded numerous violent incidents in that area during that era, especially between midnight and dawn. If Brian encountered the wrong person, it could have unfolded in seconds. A shove, a strike, a weapon, a moment of vulnerability, a split-second decision by someone with no hesitation. In such a scenario, an attacker could have incapacitated him, transported him quickly, placed him in a vehicle, driven off before anyone noticed. If this happened, Brian wouldn't appear on cameras because he wouldn't be walking. He'd be inside a car. The chilling part? No camera pointed at the street outside the Tuna saw anything unusual. But in 2006, blind spots still existed. When bodies disappear in an urban setting, water becomes a critical search focus. The Olentangy River flows less than half a mile from the neighborhood. It is not a large river, but it has. When it has river, when it has a decipole. Because in here Xander, with bedded dead it have, with nevermores, in the run, with nevermores, with nevermores, with nevermores, strong currents, drop-offs, debris, indecent, muddy banks, concealed areas beneath bridges. If Brian had wandered near the river, confused or impaired, he could have slipped or fallen in. Investigators searched the river multiple times. Boats scanned surface and nearshore areas. Divers explored deeper points. Dogs swept the banks. Helicopters conducted aerial sweeps. Nothing surfaced. Not clothing, not a wallet, not a phone, not Brian. Some argued the river didn't take him. Others believed its currents could have carried him out of sight before the search. The river gave no answers, but it also gave no closure. With every search area cleared, investigators were left with a list of conclusions that deepened the mystery. Brian was not in the construction site. He was not in the bar. He was not in the dumpsters. He was not in the river. He was not seen on any camera leaving. No witness recalled him exiting. No physical evidence pointed to an outdoor confrontation. Every theory was possible. None were supported. The investigation was starting to feel like a maze, where every hallway led back to the same empty room, and that room was inside the Ugly Tuna. As days turned into weeks, detectives noticed something. Whenever they tried to push the investigation outward, the evidence or the absence of it pushed them back inward. It kept leading them to the same place. The last verified location, the last recorded movement, the last known image. Brian Schaefer was last seen outside the bar's entrance, heading back inside. And yet, somehow, he was never seen leaving. This realization marked the beginning of a new investigative focus, one that would dive deeper into hidden passageways, structural access points, employee-only areas, the trash disposal system, and the patterns of every person present that night. Because if Brian did not leave the building, then something or someone inside that environment holds the key. In the next continuation, we explore the deeper structural mysteries of the building, the theories involving the construction zone, and the chilling possibility that Brian's disappearance may not involve the outside world at all. When investigators realized that none of the outside theories fully explained Brian's disappearance, their attention returned to the only place that made sense, the building itself. The ugly Tuna Saloon sat on the second floor of the South Campus Gateway, a structure that, in 2006, was still evolving, expanding, and under active renovation. It wasn't a polished entertainment district yet. It was a patchwork. Bars beside, half-finished hallways, shops beside construction, scaffolding, public spaces beside restricted work zones, a building alive with noise, and hiding quiet, unseen corners. If Brian didn't walk out, then the answer, however illogical, had to be found in the architecture, the infrastructure, or the human flow inside that building. This was not a simple bar. This was a maze. The ugly Tuna occupied a relatively small, one-room footprint. But the building around it was not small. Behind the bar, and beneath it, lay unfinished utility corridors, maintenance shafts, electrical rooms, a service elevator area, a long hallway leading toward a locked door, and a construction zone filled with scaffolding and debris. None of these areas had interior surveillance cameras at the time. This meant that once Brian stepped inside the bar, if he truly went back inside, he could have walked into areas where no camera would ever see him again. To unravel this, investigators began analyzing building access, the areas available to employees, and the areas accessible only by accident or misfortune. Behind the main bar area was a service hallway used primarily by employees, indiscreeser, delivery drivers, maintenance staff. To Reban, the hallway led to a freight elevator, a loading dock entry, a corridor that was partially blocked, and a door that opened into a large construction space. On busy nights, this hallway was often left partially open long enough for staff to slip through. Witnesses said that during crowded events, patrons sometimes wandered into this hallway accidentally. No employees remembered Brian there, but no one could rule it out. If he entered that hallway, two possibilities emerged. He could have gotten lost in the construction zone, or something happened to him without witnesses. Neither possibility left a trace. This theory unsettled investigators most of all. At the time Brian vanished, the construction zone behind the bar was dim, unmonitored, videos completely stay or emios, filled with equipment, layered with multiple floors of scaffolding mead, covered in dust and debris, partly blocked from public access, not fully mapped, constantly shifting radar. Workers who returned in the days after the disappearance acknowledged that the site was cluttered and hazardous. Heavy machinery had moved through. Construction dumpsters had been filled and hauled away. If a person fell somewhere, behind equipment, between stacked materials, into a shaft, beneath scaffolding, or anywhere heavy debris shifted afterward, they could be concealed long enough for the environment itself to bury the evidence. Cadaver dogs swept the site, but dogs have limitations. Inhale strong construction odors, heavy dust, airflow disruption, chemical interference, the building's ventilation system. All of these could impact detection. To this day, investigators admit this possibility cannot be fully eliminated. One of the darker internal theories revolved around the building's freight elevator. Elevators under construction or undergoing maintenance sometimes have unguarded shafts, open mechanical areas, temporary platforms, Unsealed drop spaces. If Brian entered the wrong door, or leaned where someone shouldn't, or simply didn't realize a particular area wasn't a hallway, a catastrophic fall was possible. Search teams checked accessible shafts. Maintenance crews checked others. But early confusion during construction made records inconsistent. There is no definitive proof Brian fell. There is also no definitive proof he didn't. Of all the internal theories, this one caused the most debate. The Ugly Tuna and the building's businesses shared industrial trash chutes connecting to dumpsters below. A person could not climb inside voluntarily, but a body placed inside could travel down quickly, quietly, and without detection. This theory requires something sinister: that Brian died inside the bar or building, that someone panicked, and that someone used the chute to hide him. Before trash pickup arrived in the early morning hours, trash was collected regularly early on weekends. Landfills were massive. Finding evidence after the delay was nearly impossible. Police searched trash areas. They examined dumpsters. They checked sanitation routes. Nothing surfaced. But this theory has never been fully ruled out. There was another escape path: the emergency exit near the bar. It was positioned just outside camera range. It opened into a back alley behind the building. Employees said it was often used improperly for smoke breaks, shortcuts, or quick access during cleanup. If Brian exited through this door, he would not appear on camera. He would walk into a poorly lit alley. He would be vulnerable and alone, and he could travel unseen into a crime-heavy area. Within seconds, this remained one of the most plausible theories. The emergency exit was checked. Dogs swept it. Officers searched the alley. Again, nothing was found. Some theorists wondered whether Brian may have fallen or jumped from the balcony. Investigators considered this. They inspected the courtyard. They searched the bushes. They checked for injuries or drag marks. But a fall from that height would have caused noise, witnesses, and immediate discovery. There was no sign of a fall. No injury reported. No disturbance. No trace. This theory faded. By the end of the interior investigation, police had searched every hallway, house, every closet, every room, the construction zone, the elevator access, the service corridors, the emergency exit routes, the maintenance spaces, the dumpsters and trash systems. What they found was devastating in its emptiness. Brian was nowhere, which left investigators with only two conclusions. Either Brian left the building unseen, an improbable, but not impossible, feat, or something happened inside that left no evidence at all. A disappearance without physical trace is extraordinarily rare, but it had happened, and the building itself seemed to hold its breath, as if keeping the secret. In the next continuation, we shift focus to the most emotional part of the case: the people left behind: Brian's father, his brother Derek, Alexis, and the unanswered letters begging for the truth from the last known friend to see him. While investigators dissected blind spots and building blueprints, another story was unfolding, quieter, heavier, and far more painful. It was the story of the people Brian left behind. People who checked their phones constantly. People who didn't sleep for days. People who answered every withheld call, hoping it was him. People who walked into police stations with trembling hands. People who waited and still wait for answers. Brian's disappearance is not just a true crime mystery. It is a wound that never closed for his family and those who loved him. And the deeper investigators looked into the human side of the case, the more heart-wrenching and complicated it became. Brian wasn't the kind of son who drifted away from his parents. He wasn't distant. He wasn't emotionally detached. He was devoted. He had just lost his mother, a pain so profound that even friends noticed the shift in him. She had been his emotional anchor, his confidant, the steady warmth in his life. Her death left a void, but it also made him draw closer to the people he had left, especially his younger brother, Derek, especially his father, Randy, and especially Alexis, the woman he planned to take to Miami in just a matter of days. These relationships matter because they helped investigators understand one thing clearly. Brian did not walk out of his life willingly. Not when the people in it meant everything to him. Imagine coming home from a family emergency, excited to see your boyfriend before your vacation. Imagine climbing the stairs to his apartment. Imagine seeing his car exactly where he left it, walking in, and realizing the bed hasn't been slept in. Nothing is disturbed, and the room feels undisturbed, almost frozen. Alexis later said the silence in that room felt wrong, like the space itself knew he wasn't coming back. She waited for him. Hours passed. She called him again and again. Each time, voicemail. She drove the streets. She checked the bars. She retraced the path from the ugly tuna to home. Nothing. When she finally called Randy, she could barely form the words. Brian is missing. Derek Schaefer was not just Brian's younger brother. He was, in Brian's words, his best friend. After their mother died, the two leaned heavily on each other. They talked often. They made plans. They supported their father through grief. So when Brian disappeared, Derek stepped into a version of adulthood no one is prepared for. He searched. He pleaded. He gave interviews. He checked every rumor. He chased every lead. He held his father upright through unbearable pain. Years later, Derek admitted something heartbreaking. He believed Brian was gone, not because he wanted to, because the evidence, or the lack of it, left no other reality. And the anger he felt toward one person in particular never faded. Randy Schaefer did everything a father could do. He visited the bar. He begged for help. He confronted the silence. He waited at home, hoping the door would open. He wrote letters long, emotional pleas not to strangers, but to the last known friend to see Brian. He didn't accuse. He didn't threaten. He begged. He asked Clint to talk. He asked Clint to help. He asked Clint to come clean if he knew anything. He received no response. Not one line. Not one word. Not one sign of cooperation. Even as police insisted Clint had no obligation to talk, Randy felt the silence as a weight he couldn't lift. And then, tragedy struck again. In September of 2008, while clearing storm debris outside his home, a tree branch fell and killed him instantly. He died without knowing what happened to his son. He died believing someone out there knew more than they said. He died with questions in his heart that never found answers. Just days before he vanished, Brian called Alexis from the bar at around 10 in the evening. He told her he loved her. He couldn't wait for Miami. He was exhausted from midterms. He'd see her soon. It was warm. It was normal. It was full of promise. She saved that voicemail. For years, she replayed it. Not because she expected a clue, but because it was the last piece of him she ever heard. Those words, "I love you," echoed louder after he disappeared. One chilling detail kept surfacing. Days after Brian vanished, Alexis's phone received a call from his number. Just once. It rang. She froze. She answered. Silence. Investigators later confirmed it was likely a phantom call, a glitch caused by a cell tower ping, not a real call placed by a person. But for one horrifying moment, Alexis believed Brian was alive. For a moment, she felt hope. For a moment, it felt like a rescue. But hope dissolved into static, and silence returned. The investigation had its theories. The public had its speculation. The internet had its rabbit holes. But the people who knew Brian, truly knew him, hold the most important truth. Brian Schaefer was loved. He was planning for a future. He was grieving, but living. He had reasons to stay. He had no reasons to run. And the silence surrounding his disappearance, the refusal of certain individuals to speak, became its own kind of evidence. Not proof, but a shadow stretching across the case. Because in the months and years after Brian vanished, investigators realized something crucial. After months of interviews, searches, and unanswered questions, investigators reached a point that every complex case eventually arrives at. They had evidence. They had witness statements. They had hours of footage. They had maps, timelines, and cadaver dog reports. But they still did not have Brian. So detectives turned to what remains when all physical avenues are exhausted: theories. Not wild speculation. Not internet rumors. But structured investigative models, each weighed against the facts, psychology, timeline, and environment. 4 major theories emerged. And although all remain technically possible, only one continues to carry the most weight nearly 20 years later. Let's examine them exactly as investigators did. This was one of the first theories police explored. The idea: Brian, overwhelmed by grief and exhaustion, walked away to start a new life. To test this theory, investigators asked: 1. Did he display any signs of suicidal thoughts? No. 2. Did he withdraw money? No. 3. Did he pack belongings? No. 4. Did he buy tickets, rent a car, or show digital movement? No. 5. Did he have a history of running away? None. 6. Did he have a motive to leave family, friends, or his girlfriend? Absolutely none, in fact. All evidence pointed toward a man holding tightly to his relationships after losing his mother. And the most crucial detail: his trip to Miami with Alexis was just days away. A trip he spoke about with excitement. People who plan to disappear do not plan vacations, or think about proposals, or call their girlfriend saying, "I love you," before vanishing into the night. This theory faded quickly. Another viable theory was that Brian left unseen and suffered an accident. Police mapped the area: poorly lit corridors, to stairwells, drop-offs, construction pits, alleys with deep shadows, the path toward the river. But this theory began to weaken under several points. 1. No camera caught him outside the building. Not one. 2. No witnesses saw him walking alone. Impossible to miss on a campus weekend, yet no one recalled him. 3. The river searches found nothing. Multiple sweeps, all clean. 4. Environmental hazards that night were not unusual. Nothing suggested he could fall somewhere without being discovered. This theory remained possible, but it required Brian to avoid every camera on High Street, every witness, and every form of trace. Possible? Yes. Probable? Not quite. Columbus, in 2006, saw its share of crime. Late-night violence in that district was not uncommon. If Brian left through a blind spot, a predator could have followed him. A robbery could have escalated. He could have been forced into a car or injured during a confrontation. This would explain the lack of camera footage, the immediate disappearance, the total absence of financial activity. It would not explain why no struggle was heard, why no dropped belongings were found, why no witnesses saw anything, why canvassing never revealed suspicious activity. Still, investigators consider this a credible theory, especially if Brian exited the building at a point not covered by camera. This remains the most controversial theory, and the one that refuses to die. To many investigators, journalists, and armchair detectives, this theory carries weight not because of dramatic speculation, but because of the evidence. Or rather, the absence of it. When a person disappears, there is usually a witness bracket, a sound insubordinate, a struggle, a camera capture. .com, a trail. In Marcus, our day, a clue. Anything. But here, nothing. Brian enters the bar. He is seen talking with friends. He walks back inside. And then, he never appears again. Not leaving the bar. Not in the building's exterior. Not anywhere on the street. This single fact has kept the inside the building theory alive. The bar had multiple areas that lacked cameras, were dark, as were under construction, were easily accessed if unlocked, were confusing to navigate while intoxicated. Brian could have. It slipped into the construction zone, fallen into an unprotected shaft, gotten trapped behind scaffolding dock, become unconscious behind equipment tow. If that happened, the building's movement, construction shifts, and heavy machinery could have made recovery impossible. This theory is chilling, but investigators examined it because it was structurally possible. If Brian died inside the building, an employee or panicked individual could have used the industrial chute-ope to dispose of his body. Before morning trash collection, the bins were emptied early. The landfill was massive. and the first police search was delayed by over 24 hours. This theory lacks evidence, but also lacks disproof. The emergency exit sat just outside the camera's field of vision. If Brian used this door, no camera would capture it. He'd walk into a dark alley. He could be vulnerable instantly. Any crime or accident could happen. With zero visibility, this exit remains one of the most critical unanswered components of the case. Reason for human behavior. Crowded bars mask noise. Arguments are lost in bass. Falls are mistaken for drunken stumbles. Doors open and close constantly. If something small happened, a wrong step, a momentary lapse, an accident in a restricted space, the bar's noise could swallow it whole. And in that brief moment, Brian could vanish into a place where no one thought to look soon enough. Nearly 20 years later, most investigators, reporters, and analysts quietly agree. The most likely scenario is that Brian never left the building through a normal exit. Whether by accident, misadventure, disorientation, or something darker, the environment inside the gateway, with its construction zones, service access, and blind spots, remains the most logical explanation for an illogical disappearance. But even with this theory, there is no body, no evidence, no trace. That is what makes the Brian Schaefer case one of the most baffling unsolved disappearances of the modern era. The Zasederich has to pritted. In the next continuation, we explore something deeper. The psychological angle, Brian's mental state, grieving process, behavior that night, and the one small detail that may reveal whether he intended to leave anyone or whether tragedy seized him unexpectedly. To understand a disappearance, investigators don't just look at where a person went. They look at who the person was. Not in a shallow, surface-level way, not in the way social media paints a smiling picture, but in the way real lives feel when they're lived. Messy, hopeful, wounded, resilient, afraid, ambitious, grieving, in love. Brian Schaefer was not just a name in a missing person flyer. He was a complex young man carrying a heavy emotional weight only weeks before he vanished. And so, detectives turned to the psychological angle, the emotional world that shaped his state of mind that night. Because sometimes the truth of what happened begins long before the moment a camera shuts off. On the 6th of March, 2006, less than 1 month before the disappearance, Brian's mother, Renee, died from a rare form of cancer. Her death devastated him. Family described their bond as unusually close, as emotional, deeply affectionate, almost best friend level. Brian visited her constantly during treatment. He talked about her constantly. He cried with his brother Derek. He leaned on Alexis. He leaned on his father, Randy. But grief affects everyone differently. Some collapse under it. Some drown quietly. Some keep moving but carry the sorrow like a heavy coat they never take off. Brian kept moving, but the weight never left his shoulders. Friends said he seemed tired, muted, not depressed, but deeply wounded. A grief like that doesn't disappear in a few weeks, but it also doesn't explain why a man would walk away from everyone who loved him. This grief angle mattered, but it didn't solve the case. Brian was studying to become a doctor, a path he chose not for money, but for purpose. Yet medical school is exhausting, restaurant, relentless, mentally draining, emotionally demanding. And Brian had just finished midterms that week. He was under pressure for his upcoming board exams. He was barely sleeping. He was pushing through stress layered over grief. So yes, investigators believed he was exhausted. But exhaustion does not make a man disappear. It makes him tired, not invisible. One of the most grounding truths about Brian's mental state was something incredibly simple. He was excited about Miami. His girlfriend, Alexis, said. He talked about the trip constantly. He needed the break. They planned beach days. He hinted at a future together rage. He even hinted at a proposal Ren. People preparing to propose do not quietly walk off the edge of their life. They do not vanish without access to money. They do not abandon loved ones. They do not leave all personal belongings untouched. Miami wasn't a distraction. It was a signpost pointing to Brian's hopes, and hopes argue against voluntary disappearance. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, Brian stepped aside at the bar and called Alexis. She remembers the call clearly, the tone of his voice, the warmth, the ease. He said he loved her. He couldn't wait to see her. He was tired from midterms. He'd talk to her in the morning. Nothing in his voice suggested despair. Nothing suggested a man planning to vanish. It was a normal call, the last normal thread tying him to the life he loved. Investigators considered another factor: intoxication. Brian had been bar hopping, drinking heavily, celebrating the end of midterms. Alcohol can impair judgment, enter slow reflexes, cause disorientation, lead to wandering, make someone vulnerable to assault, increase risk of accidents. So yes, intoxication mattered. But again, drunk people don't vanish into thin air. They leave clues. They stumble into camera frames. They fall where they can be found. Someone notices. Brian was drunk. But that alone didn't explain the perfect disappearance. Psychologists reviewing the case later suggested Brian may have been in a state of cognitive overload. Grief, school pressure, exhaustion, alcohol, noise, crowds, emotional weight. When the mind is overwhelmed, it seeks space. It seeks quiet. It seeks air. Some theorize that Brian may have stepped away. Not to run away, not to disappear, but simply to breathe, to find quiet, to process his thoughts, to step into a hallway or door that seemed peaceful in contrast to the bar's chaos. If he walked into the wrong corridor, a poorly lit construction area, the environment could have claimed him before he realized the danger. This was not a theory of suicide, nor a theory of abandonment. It was a theory of being human. A theory of one moment of vulnerability intersecting with one unsafe environment. After reviewing every emotional angle, investigators reached one unanimous conclusion: Brian Schaefer did not choose to disappear. He had, as he hopes, plans. It's Sibley, asked owed, and family, responsibilities, money, he expected, a flight days away, no signs of detachment. His psychology did not match voluntary disappearance. It matched a young man struggling through grief, but still deeply connected to his life. Whatever happened to him, it wasn't planned, it wasn't chosen, and it wasn't something he walked into intentionally. It was something that happened to him, and it happened fast. In every disappearance, there comes a point when investigators must turn their attention not only to where the missing person went, but who was there when they disappeared. Not because they assume guilt, not because they jump to conclusions, but because the people closest to the final moments are the ones who hold the most precious pieces of the truth. What the missing person said go, how they behaved, who they interacted with, whether tension existed, whether something was off-dash, and whether even the smallest detail could change everything. And on the night Brian Schaefer disappeared, only two people shared those final moments: Clint Florence and Meredith Reed. Their stories mattered. Their silences mattered. Their choices mattered. Because when the last known witnesses refuse to speak, the silence becomes louder than any words they might have offered. Clint was Brian's friend. Meredith was Clint's friend who joined them midway through the night. The trio bar hopped, as astounded as remained, drank heavily, laughed, moved through crowds together, and eventually returned to the Ugly Tuna late that night. For investigators, the timeline inside the bar hinged entirely on their testimony, and though their story has remained consistent on paper, it has never been airtight in spirit. Let's break down the key points. The claim: Brian wanted to speak with the band. Narrator: analytical. According to Clint, Brian left them to talk to the band. But here is the list of what investigators found. No band member remembered talking to him. No staff member saw him near the stage. No patrons recalled seeing him there. No witnesses could verify his presence. This does not mean Clint lied, but it does mean the story rests solely on his word. And because there is no camera footage inside the bar, the moment Brian stepped out of view becomes a dark gap only Clint and Meredith's recollections can fill. Clint and Meredith said he searched the bar, checked the bathrooms, called Brian, really had texted him, waited outside, assumed he'd left early. It went home. The calls and texts they claimed to make did appear consistent with the timeline. But there is still a question that troubles investigators. Why didn't they alert security? Why didn't they ask staff to make a closing announcement? Why didn't they notify someone inside the building immediately? Instead, they left believing Brian would simply show up later. This choice was not suspicious on its own, but it was unusual. This is the moment that has lingered in every theory. Clint later told investigators that he went to Brian's apartment and waited there for 6 hours. 6 hours alone. 6 hours without contacting police. 6 hours without calling Brian's father. 6 hours sitting in silence in an empty apartment. This behavior raised flags, not because it implied guilt, but because it was deeply inconsistent with normal worry. People do not normally wait silently for 6 hours when their friend disappears. They contact other friends, alert authorities, ET, call families, retrace steps, or ask for help. Clint did none of this. When police asked the two friends to take a polygraph, Meredith took the test. She passed. But Clint refused. Not once, not twice. He refused permanently. He then hired an attorney. He stopped returning calls. He gave no further statements. He avoided interviews. He distanced himself entirely from the investigation. Police have always emphasized, refusing a polygraph is not an admission of guilt. Everyone has the right to decline. And yet, in a case where a man vanished in front of dozens of people from a building full of blind spots, under unknown circumstances, Clint's refusal weighed heavily on the hearts of Brian's family, not as proof of wrongdoing, but as a heartbreaking wall between them and answers. Years later, Clint was subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury. He declined, legally, but decisively. He did not appear. He gave no testimony. He offered no clarifications. And the silence stretched further. Before his tragic death, Randy Schaefer, Brian's father, wrote Clint heartfelt letters. He didn't accuse. He didn't threaten. He simply begged. He said, "If you know something, even the smallest thing, please tell us. We're begging you for help." Clint never responded. Not once. To a grieving father, silence felt like betrayal. To a desperate brother, silence felt like hiding. To investigators, silence was not evidence. But it was not nothing. It is important to state clearly, police have never named Clint a suspect. Police have never identified him as a person of interest. Police have never accused him of wrongdoing. All official statements emphasize, no evidence ties him to foul play. He is under no legal obligation to speak well. He cannot be forced to take a polygraph from. And yet, in nearly every interview, investigators admit the same truth. They wish Clint would talk, not because they believe he's guilty, but because they believe he may hold details, even small ones, that could shift the entire understanding of what happened. Sometimes cases don't need guilt, they need clarity. And clarity requires cooperation. When someone disappears, timelines matter, camera angles matter, phone records matter, but so do people. Human behavior, human silence, human choices. The case is not built around suspicion of Clint. It is built around the simple fact that he was the last person with Brian, and he did not or could not offer answers. In unsolved cases, sometimes the biggest void isn't the missing person. Sometimes it's the missing truth. To understand the disappearance of Brian Schaefer, investigators eventually had to abandon the wide view the entire night, the entire bar, the entire city. The answers weren't in the big picture. They were in the final 10 minutes. The sliver of time where the world swallowed a man whole. This is the part of the story where we zoom in so close that every second becomes its own chapter, where every angle, every blind spot, every choice becomes potentially life-altering. Because somewhere between 1:55 a.m. and 2:05 a.m., Brian Schaefer stopped existing in the public eye. And to understand how, we must reconstruct it, piece by piece, moment by moment, step by step. At 1:55 in the morning, Brian appears on camera outside the ugly Tuna Saloona. He is smiling. He is talking to two women friends of Clint. He is swaying slightly, clearly intoxicated but not stumbling. His posture is relaxed. His body language is open. His mood appears normal. This moment is important because it provides the last verifiable baseline. He was upright. He was coherent. He was engaged socially. He was physically steady. And then, after a casual goodbye, Brian turns toward the entrance of the bar and vanishes from the lens forever. Not a single camera ever sees him again. Investigators studied the layout obsessively. The ugly Tuna had one main entrance, with escalators directly facing multiple cameras. One emergency exit, just outside the camera's field of view, a blind spot. A service hallway, leading to an elevator and a construction zone. A balcony area, perceived by many as unsafe or confusing. For Brian to disappear without detection, one of two things must be true. 1. He left through a point completely invisible to cameras. 2. He never made it out of the building. There is no third option. And that harsh binary forced investigators into a rare level of scrutiny. For Brian to have left through the front exit, he would appear on at least one camera. He would show up on nearby business cameras. Police would have footage of his walk home. Witnesses would have seen him on High Street to come. None of that happened. Detectives stated with near certainty, Brian Schaefer did not exit through the front. This is the first major clue. The emergency exit is the shadow that haunts this case. It sits only a few feet outside the reach of the main camera. If Brian veered left instead of forward, he would disappear into darkness instantly. That hallway led to a pitch-black service alley, a narrow stretch of concrete now, its few working lights, and an area known for crime at night. From there, he could have been followed, been approached, gotten lost, or encountered someone dangerous. The emergency exit is the closest thing this case has to a trapdoor. A single wrong turn, one he could have made without thinking, could have placed him directly into harm's way. The bar was undergoing renovations. Behind it were the scaffolds, open shafts, dumpsters, maintenance rooms, restricted hallways, uneven floors, in place, blind corners, and most importantly, zero cameras. Investigators admitted there were multiple hazardous points where a drunken person could become injured or trapped without immediate detection. If Brian wandered in, he could fall. He could get stuck. He could lose consciousness. He could succumb to injury. And by the time anyone searched, construction equipment had moved. Debris had been cleared. Dumpsters had been emptied. Heavy machinery had shifted positions. One small misstep, one moment of disorientation, could create a tragedy with no recovery. Though heartbreaking, investigators could not ignore it. Inside the building was a commercial trash chute, large, metal, industrial, designed for bulk disposal. If Brian became injured or unconscious inside the building, and if someone panicked, throwing him into the chute would remove him from sight instantly. Trash collection occurred early that morning. The landfill was massive. Police did not secure the building for over 24 hours. If this happened, there would be no evidence left, not a trace. Investigators have never found proof, but they have also never disproven it. Around 2 o'clock, only minutes after Brian is last seen, Clint and Meredith say Brian went to talk to the band. A crowd begins thinning. The bar is approaching last call. People are paying tabs. Noise is high. Staff is moving quickly. Somewhere within these chaotic minutes, Brian disappears into a space no witness remembers and no camera captures. This is the moment the timeline cracks, because from this point on, Brian is unaccounted for. No one can confirm seeing him alive, and no physical evidence remains. By 2:05 a.m., Clint and Meredith are searching inside. They check bathrooms. They use their phones. They wait outside. The bar empties. Security ushers remaining customers out had. Still, no Brian. And from this moment, the case shifts from confusion to impossibility. Because at 2:05 a.m., investigators believe Brian Schaefer either left through a perfect blind spot or never left the building alive. There is no other viable conclusion, and the people who knew him are forced to live inside that horrifying uncertainty. The 10-minute window was small, but the darkness within it was absolute. Distant echoes, the hollow acoustics of an unfinished structure. The camera pans through dark corridors, the kind of places where sound disappears and shadows multiply. I can, narrator, measured, forensic. To understand how a man could vanish inside a building in the early 21st century, with cameras, crowds, and noise, you must understand the building itself. The Gateway Complex was not just a bar. It was not a simple one-room establishment. It was a labyrinth, a layered, multi-level structure filled with hidden corners, blind hallways, and half-finished construction zones that investigators later described as dark, confusing, and difficult to navigate, even sober. Imagine a structure that is half entertainment space, half work site. Imagine alcohol. Imagine exhaustion. Imagine grief. Imagine one wrong turn. This is the architectural reality that shaped the disappearance of Brian Schaefer. Tonight, we walk into that building and into the places he could have gone and never returned from. The public often imagines the Gateway as being fully monitored, but investigators quickly realized the truth. Only select areas were under surveillance. The cameras were placed to monitor the escalator, the main entrance, the front exterior, the emergency exit alley, partially exit, nearby businesses' sidewalks. But the cameras did not cover the upper interior of the barbers, the stage area, taction, hallways behind the bar, construction corridors, the service elevator zones, one stairwells, maintenance hallways, is supply closets, the trash disposal route. In essence, the cameras could confirm who went in, but not who went where once they were inside. And more importantly, they could not confirm who went out through non-main exits. One camera angle being even a few inches off could erase someone's existence from the digital record. And in Brian's case, that is exactly what happened. Footage showed dozens of people moving up the escalator, down the escalator, in and out of the main entrance. Every face was eventually accounted for, except one, Brian. This was not a glitch, not a technical failure, not an oversight. He simply never appeared. This led investigators to a chilling architectural truth. If Brian did not descend that escalator, the only way out was somewhere the cameras could not see. Directly left of the main entrance, close enough to touch, was a narrow hallway. The camera angle stopped just short of capturing its length. Inside that hallway was the emergency exit, a metal push-bar door, no alarm connected, commonly used by staff and smokers, leading directly into a dark concrete alley. That alley had no camera coverage, no streetlights, no foot traffic at 2 in the morning, no immediate visibility from High Street Hast. If Brian walked into that hallway, he would vanish instantly, be invisible to cameras, to be isolated, be vulnerable. Investigators concluded that if he left the bar on his own, this was the most logical path and the most dangerous. Behind the bar, beyond a small service hallway, was the construction area. This was not a simple storage room. It was a full-scale renovation space containing scaffolding stacks, 8 tool carts, boards with exposed nails, concrete dust, unstable flooring, dark corners, half-built walls, open pipes, ventilation shafts, unsecured ladders, dark drop-offs, narrow choke points, and areas where noise would not carry Buddy. Investigators later admitted that if Brian stumbled in, he could have fallen, he could have hit his head, he could have become trapped, and nobody would hear him. The bar's music, the closing time noise, the crowds, all of it would drown out a cry or a fall. And by the time searches began, the area had changed enough that any trace, footprints, scuffs, debris shifts, would be erased. Few spaces terrified investigators more than the areas around the service elevators. These shafts were deep way, his life dark, partially enclosed, bordered by construction material, without protective barriers in certain places. If Brian entered that zone intoxicated, a misstep could cause a fall. A fall could be fatal, and a body inside a mechanical structure could remain undiscovered for days, weeks, or even longer. Maintenance staff later told detectives there were places in that area where someone could fall and not be seen from above unless you were standing in the exact right spot. This was one of the darkest architectural truths of the building, and one of the most realistic. The building's commercial trash disposal system was large enough to fit heavy bags, broken furniture, full food waste bins, and tragically, a human body. If Brian was injured, unconscious, or worse in one of the back areas, and if someone panicked, or acted recklessly, or maliciously, placing him in the chute would remove him from sight, bypass the main cameras, send him directly to a dumpster, ensure he was collected within hours. And because police were delayed in taking the case seriously, the trash had already been hauled to a massive landfill. Searching that landfill would have required heavy machinery, weeks of manpower, thousands of dollars, a precise timeline, and Columbus simply didn't have the data in time. This is one of the darkest but most physically plausible explanations investigators ever had to consider. Some speculated that Brian could have fallen from the balcony. While possible, the scenario had major flaws. The drop was not extremely high. People were nearby. A fall would be loud. Someone would have noticed. His body would not remain hidden. Investigators ranked this theory as one of the least likely. But in disappearances, every possibility matters, even the fragile ones. When you combine alcohol, fatigue, as are grief, noise, as crowds, construction, multiple exits, camera blind spots, a coin flip moment of misdirection, you get a rare and terrifying equation. A man in a crowded, camera-filled building can disappear without a single trace, not because of a perfect crime, but because of a perfect storm. And that storm happened between 1:55 a.m. and 2:05 a.m. 10 minutes. 10 tiny minutes. 10 silent minutes. The kind of minutes that define mysteries for decades. Once investigators exhausted the internal possibilities, every dark room, every construction corridor, every unseen corner of the building, they turned to the world outside. Because if Brian Schaefer somehow left the building without being seen, the outside environment had to tell the rest of the story. The city he stepped into was not the glossy college town postcard image tourists imagine. Not at 2 in the morning. Not during the rowdiest part of the school year. Not on a weekend when alcohol, exhaustion, and crime formed a dangerous combination. Columbus investigators called the area a place where a person walking alone at that hour could be an easy target. Tonight, we step into that outside world. The sidewalks, the alleys, the shadows, to understand what could have happened. In the next few minutes, after Brian stepped off camera forever, Columbus is a city stitched with surveillance. Bars, banks, parking garages, street corners, campus buildings, apartment entrance, shops and restaurants. If Brian had walked even a few blocks in any direction, one of those cameras should have caught him. But not one did. Not the bars he passed earlier. Not the sidewalks. Not the street corners, not the business fronts, not the garages, not the crosswalks, not the intersection cameras. This created one disturbing investigative conclusion. If Brian walked outside, he entered a blind spot that lasted long enough for him to be intercepted or disappear completely. Before reaching any other camera zone, that window would be seconds, maybe 20, maybe 30, but not much more. Brian's apartment was only about a 10-minute walk from the Ugly Tuna. A straight, predictable route. Investigators walked that path dozens of times. Day, night, dawn, late evening, drunk, sober. Every angle had cameras. Every turn had streetlights. Every step should have placed Brian in front of a lens or a witness. And yet, nothing. This forced detectives into a chilling realization. Brian never made it to the walking path. Something happened immediately after he left the bar, or immediately after he stepped into the alley. The emergency exit alley was not a normal alley. It was narrow, too, unmonitored, poorly lit, partly obstructed, blocked from the street view, surrounded by construction fencing, isolated after closing time. If Brian walked out that door, he would have found himself in nearly total darkness within seconds. There are several possibilities investigators could not ignore. 1. A robbery gone wrong. College areas had seen late-night muggings. A drunken, tired, alone young man would be an easy target. 2. An opportunistic predator. Someone lying in wait. Someone watching closing time. Someone who used the alley as hunting ground. 3. A confrontation. An argument escalating. A stranger taking offense. A bump, a wrong look, a slurred word. 4. A stumble or fall. If Brian was disoriented or drunk, a fall in the darkness could cause unconsciousness, leaving him vulnerable to the wrong person walking by. 5. A forced abduction. Fast, silent, invisible to cameras. Car pulled up. Door opened. Gone. This alley remains one of the most viable external explanations for the disappearance. Columbus police later acknowledged a fact that startled the public. The corridor between the bars and the surrounding apartments was one of the most crime-heavy paths in that part of the city. Fights, assaults, theft, drug activity, late-night altercations, intoxicated vulnerability. No cameras caught Brian here either, which supports one conclusion. Whatever happened to him happened before he reached the first camera zone, meaning he never reached the corner. He never crossed the sidewalk. He never made it to the open street. Investigators briefly considered whether Brian could have been forced into a vehicle. For this to happen, the car must have been waiting near the alley. The abductor must have acted within seconds. There could be no witnesses. The timing had to be perfect. The camera angles had to miss the vehicle. Headlights could have been off code. This is not the most likely scenario, but it was not impossible. Police could not rule out opportunistic kidnapping 7, human trafficking activity, someone following Brian Dax, someone who watched people leave the bar every weekend. The narrow alley created a rare circumstance, a place where someone could be taken without a single camera or witness in under 10 seconds. Another possibility emerged as investigators re-examined the timeline. What if someone inside the bar noticed Brian, followed him to the exit, and waited until he was alone? This could explain why no one saw the confrontation, why no one heard anything, why Brian vanished instantly, why Clint and Meredith never crossed paths with the suspect crossed. It would not require planning, just opportunity and the right moment. And that alley provided both. One harsh truth emerged repeatedly in investigator interviews. If Brian left the building and something happened to him outside, it likely happened within seconds, not minutes, not blocks away, not after walking for a long time, but immediately, because the moment he stepped outside, the cameras lost him. The street swallowed him, the timeline froze, and the rest of the world slept. In the end, investigators had to confront the possibility that Brian's disappearance was not drawn out, But instant, terrifyingly instant. We have walked through the streets. We have stepped through the alleys. We have traced the camera angles. We have examined the blind spots. We have analyzed the last witnesses. We have studied Brian's state of mind. We have followed the path he should have taken, but didn't. And now we come to the hardest, most chilling question of all. If Brian Schaefer did not walk out of the building and did not appear on any external camera, then what exactly happened inside? This is the core paradox of the case, the contradiction investigators could not solve, the question that continues to haunt professionals nearly 2 decades later. Because buildings do not swallow people. Crowds do not erase someone's existence. Construction zones do not hide a body indefinitely. And yet, in this case, something did. Tonight, we move into the final and most unsettling layer, the internal paradox, the scenario that makes no sense, yet remains the most plausible explanation. Detectives developed a crucial question early on. What if Brian never reached any exit? This possibility forced them to analyze the building not as a bar, but as a structure with dozens of potential dead ends. Because to vanish inside meant one thing: a moment of fate intersected with an environment built for confusion. Let's break down the scenarios investigators considered. With brutal honesty, there were places inside the gateway where a single wrong step meant danger. Unguarded drop-offs, construction pits, shafts behind scaffolding behind out, poorly lit maintenance spaces, unsecured flooring, areas where the ground sloped into deep mechanical wells. If Brian wandered, drunk and emotionally overwhelmed, into one of these areas, one fall, one head injury, one moment of unconsciousness, and no one would hear him. Noise, music, crowds, leaving, doors slamming, closing time chaos. If he was hurt, he had minutes, maybe seconds before he slipped beyond reach. By the time anyone searched, construction crews had rearranged equipment, moved scaffolding, taken out trash, locked new areas, patched up flooring, shifted debris. Any trace could have vanished under the churn of work. This theory was unsettlingly plausible. Sometimes disappearances happen not from harm inflicted, but from harm unprevented. The building had ventilation crawl spaces, narrow mechanical rooms, locked maintenance corridors, spaces large enough to enter into ends, small enough to trap scent, deep enough to hide F. Some of these areas were rarely accessed. If Brian stepped into one of them, thinking it was a back hallway or shortcut, and the door locked behind him, or he fell between machinery, or the path angled downward, he could have been trapped, conscious or unconscious, alive for hours, or minutes, or seconds. And because the initial search was delayed, no one would hear him call for help. No one would think to check those hidden spaces. No one imagined he could be inside the building. This remains one of the most tragic but structurally realistic possibilities. This is the darkest internal theory. One investigators discussed privately, but rarely publicly. During construction, debris was swept, tossed, to bagged as, thrown into the chute, taken to dumpsters, loaded onto early morning trucks, transported to landfills, and on that weekend, the schedule was aggressive. If Brian Willis Felbury collapsed or died in an unseen space, near the areas where debris was handled, he could have been mistaken for a large bag, heavy material, construction waste, and deposited into the trash stream. Before searches even began, landfills processed tens of thousands of pounds of material daily. Once the dumpsters were emptied, there was no realistic way to find him. This scenario is not a conclusion, but investigators admitted, privately, that it could not be ruled out. Brian had been drinking heavily. He stressed, exhausted, exhausted, exhausted. It is grieving, physically drained. A medical emergency was possible. Sudden fainting, dehydration collapse, cardiac irregularity, alcohol-induced blackout. vol, resulting in head trauma. If this occurred in a hidden part of the building, he could have lost consciousness without anyone noticing. And without immediate help, even a minor medical event could have turned fatal if his body ended up behind debris, under scaffolding rever, inside a maintenance area, or among materials later cleared, or deep in a non-public zone. He could simply disappear under layers of construction turnover. This is the most controversial, but cannot be dismissed. What if something happened inside the bar that involved another person? Not necessarily murder, but panic. Imagine a sudden altercation, an accident, a fall, a moment of chaos, a person or employee in the wrong place at the wrong time. Imagine fear. Imagine shock. Imagine the instinct to cover it up. Instead of calling for help, this theory is not supported by direct evidence, but it remains possible because someone inside may have panicked. Someone may have moved Brian Noom. The building had dozens of unmonitored spaces. The disposal system made cover-up strangely feasible, and the timeline allowed it. This theory is not accusation. It is acknowledgement that human fear has led to rash decisions in other cases. It only remains in the file because no alternative fully explains the lack of evidence. After 2 decades, hundreds of interviews, architectural analysis, and repeated reevaluations, investigators, journalists, and independent analysts continue to return to the same conclusion. There is a strong possibility Brian Schaefer never left the building, not because it makes sense, but because everything else makes even less sense. When a man cannot be found on cameras, sidewalks, roads, air footage, and then homes, airports, buses, infrared, trains, phone networks, bank accounts, in the social media, medical records, there is only one remaining truth. His disappearance happened in the place and time where the evidence stops, inside the gateway, between 1:55 and 2:05 in the morning, in a silent moment where camera vision ended and confusion began. This is the internal paradox, the disappearance that defies logic, yet aligns with the only available facts. Almost 20 years, 20 years of interviews, 20 years of scanning footage, 20 years of tracing phone records, 20 years of reconstructing timelines, 20 years of watching a family hold on to hope with white-knuckled desperation. And still, Brian Schaefer is missing. This is not just a cold case. It is a silent case. A case where every path ends in a wall, every lead dissolves, every clue contradicts another. And yet, investigators, journalists, and the Schaefer family remain convinced that the case can be solved. But to understand why it hasn't been, you must understand what has stood in the way. Because behind the mystery is a series of obstacles, some systemic, some circumstantial, some painfully human, that turn this into one of the most confounding disappearances of the century. Tonight, we confront those obstacles. We examine why this case remains unsolved and what it will take to break through nearly 2 decades of silence. When Alexis realized Brian was missing, she called police immediately, but officers refused to file a report, telling the family to wait until the morning. He's probably sleeping it off. They did not visit the bar, secure the building, check dumpsters, pull surveillance, ping his phone, question witnesses. Instead, they waited. By the time the official report was filed the next day, the building had already gone through an entire night of cleaning, trash removal, and construction movement. Critical hours were lost, and with those hours, the most important opportunities to recover evidence. This delay created a ripple effect that investigators can never undo. It is one of the most tragic administrative decisions in the case. The gateway was a maze, blind hallways, hidden corners, construction zones, tapperty inivasas, Caterman signs, and ivacity potazas, unmonitored service areas, restricted tunnels, Low-lit maintenance doors. Poorly mapped structural layout. Search teams admitted privately, "We never felt confident we searched every inch," because the building changed daily. New the breeze, new walls, new barriers, new locked doors, new trash removal, new scaffolding placements. It was a dynamic environment, the worst possible place for someone to go missing. Even with repeat searches, no one could guarantee a complete sweep. This structural unpredictability remains a major reason Brian was never found. This is the part no one likes to say out loud, but it matters. Clint Florence, the last person to speak with Brian, chose silence. When asked to take a polygraph, he refused. When asked to help reconstruct the night, he refused. When subpoenaed to a grand jury, he did not show up. When Brian's father wrote to him, pleading, begging, Clint never responded. Legally, he owes no one an explanation. But emotionally, morally, ethically, his silence became one of the heaviest obstacles in the entire investigation. Because if even one sentence he knows could clarify a detail, a tone, a step, a gesture, a remark, it could reshape the entire timeline. But after almost 20 years, that sentence has never been spoken. Most disappearances leave something: end clothing, keys, scratches, blood, dropped items, camera footage, footprints, 18 sightings, objects left behind. But Brian left nothing. His wallet didn't drop. His phone didn't ping. His body didn't surface. His belongings remained untouched. No witness saw him distressed. No one heard a struggle. No cameras caught him anywhere after 1:55 a.m. It is not normal. It is not typical. It defies patterns. This total absence is why the case has no direction to move forward. The moment Brian disappeared was the worst possible time for witnesses, memory recall, visibility, security, staffing, senses, environmental conditions, detectability. Closing time at a bar is chaos. People are intoxicated, distracted, rushing out it, searching for rides, focused on friends, lost in noise, unaware of their surroundings. If someone saw Brian in distress, drunk, injured, approached, or wandering the wrong direction, they may not have processed it as anything unusual. And by the next day, the visibility window was gone. It sounds counterintuitive, but the lack of people on the streets made it harder to find witnesses. By 2 in the morning, the bars were thinning, sidewalks emptied, traffic slowed, businesses closed, students went home, meaning, if anything happened outside, there was no one to see it. No witnesses, no reports, no tips, nothing. A disappearance thrives in silence, and the world outside the bar was perfectly silent. As weeks turned to months, and months into years, something powerful happened. Leads died, memories faded, suspicions cooled, witnesses left town, phones changed, security footage expired, businesses closed, renovations finished, the bar shut down permanently. Even physical spaces where Brian could have been were remodeled, destroyed, or repurposed. The world moved on, and the longer it moved, the further Brian slipped into the cracks of time. This is why cold cases freeze, not because there are no answers, but because time buries them. In the end, investigators confronted an unsettling truth. The most likely scenario is also the least provable. The theory they return to, time and time again, is simple and devastating. Brian may never have left the building. A fall, a wrong turn, a hidden space, an accident, a panic, a disposal, a moment that spiraled into tragedy. Quietly, invisibly, and irreversibly. But without a body, without evidence, without physical proof, the most logical explanation remains forever trapped in uncertainty. And because of that uncertainty, because of those 10 minutes, lost to the darkness, this case continues to breathe. It continues to haunt. It continues to ask questions that no one can answer. Not yet. When investigators run out of leads, when footage reveals nothing, when timelines collapse into dead ends, the case remains cold. But grief does not. A disappearance does not end for the loved ones. It lingers. It expands. It reshapes every part of their lives. Tonight, we turn away from the bar, away from the alley, away from the building, and toward the people who lived the real aftermath. Because the disappearance of Brian Schaefer did not just leave a mystery. It left an empty chair at family dinners, an apartment full of silence, plane tickets waiting for a vacation that never happened, voicemails that were replayed until phones died, dreams fractured, years stolen, and questions that never stopped burning. Derek Schaefer did not just lose a brother, he lost half of himself. The brothers were close. The kind of close where one finishes the other's sentences, where grief pulls them together, where shared history makes them inseparable. When their mother died, Brian and Derek leaned on each other, more than ever before. And then, only weeks later, Brian disappeared. For Derek, the grief doubled. It compounded. It became something beyond pain. He spent years searching, following every rumor, clinging to every update, doing interviews when it hurt, reconstructing the timeline over and over and over. In his head, Derek once said, "At first, I thought maybe he ran away to clear his mind, but after a while, your heart knows the truth." He believes, as quietly and heavily as a man with scars can, that Brian is gone. But belief does not bring peace. It only brings permanence. Randy Schaefer never stopped searching. He visited the bar repeatedly. He spoke at press conferences. He begged for tips. He walked routes himself. He contacted television stations. He trusted the police. He hoped for miracles. He prayed for answers. He wrote letters, real handwritten letters, to Clint, to witnesses, to anyone who might have seen his son in those final minutes. He pleaded, "Please, if you know something, if you saw something, if you heard something, help us." But no letter was ever returned. And on a quiet September day in 2008, while clearing storm debris from his yard, a tree branch fell and took his life instantly. Randy died, without knowing what happened to his son, without clarity, without closure, without a goodbye. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part, he died still believing that someone out there knew the truth. Alexis Wagoner was more than Brian's girlfriend. She was, as her friends described, his peace in a storm. He had plans with her, real plans, a life, a marriage he hinted at, a future in Miami, children, a home filled with love. Their last phone call, the night he vanished, was ordinary, warm, full of affection. He told her, "I love you. I'll see you tomorrow. We'll talk in the morning." Words that would echo in her memory for years to come. When she returned from her family emergency, she went straight to Brian's apartment. She found his car exactly where he'd left it, his bed untouched. No sign he had been home, no noise, no movement, nothing. She called him again and again, over and over, until the battery died, then charged the phone and called again. Her heart broke. In real time, she searched the streets. She retraced his steps. She begged police to listen. She went through nights with no sleep, thinking he might walk through the door any minute. People ask why she stayed so active in the search. Alexis once gave a simple answer: you don't stop looking for the person you love. Brian had many friends, medical school classmates, bandmates, lifelong buddies. They searched too. They put up flyers. They met with detectives. They combed neighborhoods. They printed shirts. Many of them confessed years later. We felt like we failed him. Even if it wasn't logical, the guilt never left. But they did not fail him. The world failed him. The systems failed him. The building failed him. The timing failed him. They searched anyway. Because love and guilt often walk together in tragedies like this. Even as years passed, students and locals remembered. They held vigils. They lit candles. They kept his name alive. They formed Facebook groups. They posted updates. They sent tips, even the doubtful ones, just in case one might help. Brian became part of Columbus folklore, not as a ghost story, but as a wound that never closed. The Schaefer family has only ever asked one thing: not blame, not accusations, not theories. Just, if you know something, please speak. Don't let us spend the rest of our lives in darkness. Don't let silence be the final chapter. It is a plea that has echoed for almost 20 years, a plea that still stands today. Because someone, even if they don't realize it, holds a missing piece of this puzzle. And that missing piece could be the single sentence that ends a family's suffering. After years of investigating, years of searching, years of running the same questions through the same tunnels of uncertainty, law enforcement eventually reached a point where they could no longer pretend this was a case with limitless possibilities. When all the noise was stripped away, when the surveillance footage was analyzed frame by frame, when interviews led nowhere, when timelines refused to expand, and when the building itself became a character in the mystery, investigators found themselves circling back to one explanation, one theory, one scenario, one storyline that, for all its heartbreak, fits the timeline, fits the architecture, fits human behavior, and fits the utter lack of external evidence. It is not sensational. It is not cinematic. It is not full of villains or conspiracies. It is simple, tragic, quiet, accidental, and devastating. Tonight, we confront the theory that investigators do not shout from rooftops, but quietly acknowledge behind closed doors. The theory that answers the unanswerable. The theory that finally aligns every piece of the puzzle. The theory that explains how a man walked into a bar and never walked out. Investigators believe the simplest explanation is the one no one wanted to accept. Brian never made it to the front exit because he never attempted to. They believe Brian said he was going to talk to the band. He moved through the crowd. He became disoriented. Noise, alcohol, grief, and fatigue clouded his focus. He looked for a quiet spot, perhaps a hallway or corner. He stepped into a back corridor he did not recognize. The construction masking the bar layout confused him. He followed the wrong door, not the exit to the street, but the exit to a maintenance zone. The area was unlit and cluttered with equipment. He slipped or fell. He was knocked unconscious. And, tragically, his body ended up in an area that was later cleared as part of the bar's overnight construction cleanup. This theory is not sensational. It is not dramatic. It is not the kind of story movies are made about. But it is the only theory that matches. The 10-minute disappearance window. The lack of camera footage. The lack of external sightings. The timing of trash removal brangly now. The structure of the building. The chaos of closing time. Have actively. The disorientation of grief and alcohol. The architectural hazards. The nature of that night. And it is the only theory that does not require conspiracy, criminal sophistication, or unlikely precision. It requires only one thing: a moment of misdirection, inside the wrong building, at the wrong time, in the wrong state of mind. Picture the building from Brian's point of view. The bar is loud. The stage lights are flashing. His ears are buzzing from drinks and music. People are moving in every direction. The layout is confusing. Construction walls block familiar paths. Signs are missing or taped over. Certain doors look like exits, but are not. Narrow corridors feed into darker ones. Brian moves toward what he thinks is the exit, or the band area, or a kidder corner. But instead, he enters a service hallway back, or an unfinished wing, or a zone under renovation, or a poorly lit maintenance spaceman. From here, investigators believe, he never found his way back. The exact cause can never be proven, but detectives consider these the most likely possibilities. 1. A. Fall from height, down a shaft, behind equipment, or into a pit. 2. A collapse, from exhaustion, alcohol, dehydration, or emotional distress. 3. Disorientation, a wrong step into a hazardous zone not meant for the public. 4. Entrapment, becoming stuck between structural elements. 5. A head injury, rendering him unconscious within seconds. In all these scenarios, Brian would have been unable to call for help, and within minutes, cleanup crews or construction staff, working quickly and not expecting a body, may have swept, moved, or disposed of debris without realizing the gravity of what they were handling. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but accidentally, tragically, and irreversibly. One of the most painful details of the case is the timing of the dumpster pickups. Trash removal occurred early, before the police report was filed, before the building was searched, before anyone realized Brian hadn't come home. Once that trash reached the landfill, massive, chaotic, constantly shifting, impossible to fully excavate. Any remains, if they were present, would have been lost forever, beneath tons of debris. This is not speculation. It is a structural, logistical reality that investigators had to face. And it is the reason the trash chute and disposal route remains one of the most haunting elements of the entire case. Investigators return to this theory because it answers questions no other explanation can touch. Why no camera caught him outside? Because he never left the building. Why he never pinged another tower? His phone was off or broken during the incident. Why no one saw a struggle? There was no struggle, only a tragic accident. Why? The alley cameras recorded nothing. Because he didn't reach the alley. Why? No witnesses came forward. Because the event was silent and unseen. Why the building search found nothing? Because timing erased the evidence before anyone thought to look. Why his loved ones insist he would never vanish willingly? Because he didn't. And finally, why police quietly say they doubt he ever left the premises. Because every piece of data points inward, not outward. This theory is not comforting. It does not bring closure. It does not provide a villain. It does not deliver justice. It simply offers the most heartbreaking, quietly realistic explanation. Brian Schaefer died inside that building in a moment of tragic confusion, and the world lost him before anyone realized he was gone. No malice, no conspiracy, just the wrong place, the wrong moment, the wrong door, and a tragedy swallowed by time. A disappearance that was not planned, not chosen, and not intended, but profoundly, cruelly accidental. We have reached the final stretch of a story that has no ending. A story that still breathes, still hurts, still asks the same unanswered question. Almost 20 years later, where is Brian Schaefer? To close this chapter, we turn away from the theories, away from the timelines, away from the building's shadows, and toward the heart of this case, the memory of the young man whose life was interrupted in a moment no one saw coming. Because long before Brian became a headline, a mystery, a cold case, a point of debate, and a cautionary tale, he was a son, a brother, a boyfriend, a friend, a medical student, a dreamer who wanted to play music, heal people, and build a life with the woman he loved. This final section is not about evidence. It is about Brian, the human being, the life that mattered, and the life that was lost. Brian Randall Schaefer, born on a cold winter morning in February. Curious, bright, loyal, a young man who worked hard, who cared deeply, who loved fiercely. Friends described him as high warm, funny, gentle, brilliant, grounded, compassionate, A man who carried grief after losing his mother, yet still found ways to smile. A man who supported his brother with unconditional love. A man who dreamed of beaches, sunsets, music, and a quiet life with Alexis. His disappearance became a mystery, but his life was so much more than that. He laughed, he dreamed, he planned, he lived, and somewhere, a piece of that life still echoes in the memories of the people who loved him. This case did not break only one life. It fractured many. Derek, the brother who lost his best friend and carries years of unanswered questions. Alexis, the woman who waited, hoping for a call that never came. Randy, the father who searched relentlessly until the day he died. And the countless people, friends, classmates, neighbors, volunteers, who dedicated years to finding a single missing man whose absence felt too large to simply accept. Their grief is the unseen chapter of this story, the part that cameras never captured, the part no documentary can fully express. Because disappearance is not just the absence of a person, it is the presence of a wound that never heals. Despite the years, the case remains open. Detectives occasionally review it. Tips still trickle in. Old leads are revisited. New technologies are considered. And though time has buried evidence and dimmed memories, it has not extinguished the possibility of an answer. Somewhere, someone knows something. Maybe a detail they dismissed. Maybe a moment they forgot. Maybe a sentence they never connected to the night Brian vanished. One person, one memory, one overlooked moment could break this case wide open. If you have watched this far, if you've walked every step with us, if you have felt the weight of this disappearance and the ache it left behind, then we ask one thing: help keep Brian's story alive. Not for views, not for algorithms, but because visibility is often the only thing that keeps cold cases warm. So if you haven't already, like this video, leave a thoughtful comment, and hit the subscribe button so more people can learn Brian's story. And maybe, just maybe, the right person will hear it. Every engagement pushes this case into more hands, more eyes, more hearts, and maybe toward the person who knows the truth. If you know anything, no matter how small, about the disappearance of Brian Schaefer, even if you're unsure, even if it seems insignificant, even if it feels like a whisper of a memory, please contact the Columbus Police Department or submit a tip anonymously. You could be the reason this mystery finally ends. You could be the voice that brings peace to a family who has suffered long enough. Because silence protects no one. But truth? Truth can heal. Truth can free. Truth can deliver justice. Even decades later, Brian Schaefer walked into a bar in the early hours of April 1st, 2006, and vanished. But his story, his life, his memory deserves far more than a mystery without an ending. It deserves resolution. It deserves truth. And above all, it deserves witnesses who refuse to forget him. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for keeping Brian's name alive. This is Beyond the Case. Stay safe, stay aware, and never stop searching for truth.